I'm so excited to be with all of you today and continuing and completing our 3-session series on the matriarchs. We're going to be doing 4 women in 1 hour. So, fasten your seatbelts and get ready for the journey. And the way that this is going to work is that I'm going to be presenting material as I've done in the last couple of sessions. When I pause, please either write any comments you have in the chat, because I want to make this as interactive as possible, or use the raise hand feature and Julie will call on you. So I'll indicate that again when I pause, but I want to jump right into the remaining 4, I would say, women that we'll be talking about today. And you might be wondering, why 4? We have Leah, Rachel, Bilha and Zilpah. So Leah and Rachel are 2 of our 4 matriarchs, as is understood by the tradition. And Bilha and Zilpah are the handmaids. There's really not a good English translation for the word shivcha, but effectively they are enslaved by Leah and Rachel. And that's a very complicated thing, but I think it's extraordinarily critical that we address it and talk about it. And I think it's extremely important to remember that they, in fact, are the mothers of 1/3 of the tribes of Israel. And that despite the fact that they are barely mentioned in the text and mentioned it in very minimizing ways, they are a necessary and important part of our tradition. And we need to, I think it's very important to just recall that and remember that and think about the reality that Rachel and Leah were living in, which was a very complicated reality and a very complicated social positioning that they were navigating. And the story we're going to be focusing on today is Genesis 29:9 through 30:17, although I will be making mentions of Leah and Rachel and other parts of Genesis. And excuse me, I apologize for my head cold. Thank you for bearing with me. So Leah and Rachel are sisters, and they are, of course, the daughters of Lavon, Yaakov's uncle, which of course make them his cousins. Yes, there is a lot of internal marriage. That's the term that Will de Goffney, who wrote Womanist Midrash, which is a really fabulous book, uses. And we're introduced to Leah and Rachel because Rivka, tells Yaakov that he needs to flee to go to Haran to marry a woman from her home. This is, of course, after after Esav basically says to Yaakov that once the days of mourning for Isaac come about, that he will in fact murder him after Yaakov steals the blessing. We kind of left off with Rivka's story there last week. And so we are introduced to Rachel first, and we're introduced to her as a roa, as a shepherdess. And this is the very famous scene, excuse me. This is the very famous scene in which Yaakov and Rachel meet at the well, and Yaakov, with some kind of interesting strength, manages to lift a stone off the well, kisses Rachel, cries, and of course kisses Rachel before indicating who he is. And that's a really interesting detail that doesn't seem to be remarked upon in the actual text. So Rachel is Yaakov's beloved. That becomes immediately apparent after they meet at the well. And she goes back to her father Lavon and exclaims that a kinsman of Rivka, his sister, has arrived. Lavon then embraces Yaakov figuratively into the home and says, "Please come and stay with us. Please come and stay with us." Of course, we know the outline of the story. Many of us are probably quite familiar with it, that that Yaakov works 7 years to marry Rachel. Of course, there is the very famous wedding scene in which Lavon switches Leah for Rachel. And when Jacob realizes that he has married Leah and not Rachel, says to Lavon, "What have you done to me? How have you tricked me in this way?" And Lavon says quite sneakily back, "We don't do," excuse me, let me just have a sip of water real quick. We don't do, oh, yeah. We don't do what you do in your village. We don't do what you do in your village. We marry the elder before the younger. That, of course, is in direct contradiction to what Yaakov has done, which is he stole the birthright and the bracha from Esav, his brother. It's a very fascinating and kind of cutting retort that Lavon gives to Yaakov. And depending on the kind of commentaries that you read about this, there are lots of different understandings of this trickery, whether Lavon, in fact, was culpable. How do we paint Lavon? Oh, yeah. Please forgive me, folks. How we paint Lavon, how we imagine Lavon, and the ways in which Lavon is understood vis-a-vis the sisters, and how is Yaakov understood vis-a-vis the sisters. Leah, who I think is really an unsung matriarch, she doesn't get a lot of, she doesn't, I guess the best way to talk about Leah is that she is a woman of a lot of agency, but tradition really focuses on Rachel, or pays more attention to Rachel, because Rachel is Yaakov's beloved. We meet Leah in Bereshit Chavtat in Genesis 29, when we're told that she has weak eyes, in contradistinction to her sister Rachel, who is beautiful. And Yaakov loves Rachel. Now, the word in Hebrew, rokev, for her eyes, is very difficult to understand and to translate. It can be understood as weak eyes. It can be understood as some other kind of physical form or physical imperfection, quote unquote. And I think that there are lots of different ways to understand it, but we don't know definitively. And I think this is the most important piece. We don't know definitively what it means that her eyes were weak. I understand that personally to be perhaps emblematic of a visual impairment, but again, we don't know. We don't know that absolutely. What we do know, is that Rachel is beloved, Leah is not. We don't have any biographical information about Leah. We don't know anything about her childhood. We don't really even know how old she is at this point. We know, of course, she is the elder of the two sisters. And an interesting detail is that her mother goes completely unmentioned, that her and Rachel's mother goes completely unmentioned. Is she alive? Is she dead? Is she part of the family? Is she not? We don't know. But that is one of those gaping holes that I am personally quite interested. Oh, yeah. I am so sorry, folks. That is one of those gaping holes that I am really interested in figuring out a way to understand. But it is a gap in the text. And it's a gap in the text that I think we just need to honor as being there. And there are a lot of different Midrash Shame about why Leah's eyes were weak. And one of the most famous, of course, is that her eyes became weak because she cried and cried upon being told she was going to marry Esav. And that is a complicated, it's a very, very complicated, very, very complicated Midrash. But it goes back, to what we were talking about last week, with the tradition really not painting Esav well. The tradition is very interested in painting Esav in particular ways for particular historical reasons. And so it would make sense that the Midrash would follow suit, and it would make sense that Leah, having been told she was going to marry Esav, would cry incessantly over that. And so there are also interesting Midrash Shame in which Leah is, oh yeah, I'm so sorry, friends. I'm going to take a couple of sips of water and hope that that's going to help. I apologize. Thank you all for bearing with me. All right. Thank you all so much I'm so sorry about this, and thank you all for bearing with me. I really appreciate it. So the Midrash Shame, as I was going to mention, also paint Leah and Rachel as actually working together in a lot of really interesting ways, including in thinking about the, I guess you would call the switch, the trickery that Lavon does to Yaakov, which I mentioned earlier, having to do with the wedding night. And there's this midrash that actually has Leah literally lying underneath the bed and giving simanim, giving signs to Leah. Rachel being under the bed, giving signs to Leah that make Leah, or that make Yaakov assume that Leah is in fact Rachel, because Rachel does not want Leah to be humiliated. So the actual shot of the text, the plain meaning of the text, would not necessarily paint this sisterly relationship as all that cordial, perhaps. The story of Leah and Rachel is so focused on childbearing, and that is very complex. And I always, when I talk about these stories, I always want to name that the issues around fertility and infertility and childbearing, specifically in the Bible, specifically given that these are really stories of our origins as the Jewish people, can be extraordinarily complicated. And they can bring up a lot for people and bring up a lot of pain and bring up a lot of longing and discomforts. I really want to name and own that these are not emotionless stories. Neither are they in their own time, and neither are they for us as contemporary readers. What I am interested in is thinking about Leah and Rachel's relationship. And then I'm interested in also talking a little bit about them as individuals. We will then talk about Bilha and Zilpah. So Leah, again, is introduced to us as a woman who has weak eyes, in contradistinction to her sister Rachel, who is beautiful. Yaakov loves Rachel, and the text even says that Yaakov hates Leah, which is very strong, I recognize, but I think it's important to kind of name that. Now, is it actually the case that Yaakov mamash hates Leah? I think that is a harder claim to make. But it is certainly the case that she does not have the love of Yaakov in the way that her sister Rachel does. And that has a direct impact upon how she names her 4 sons. So God realizes that Leah is hated and, quote, opens her womb, which of course is the expression that we are given to talk about conception and birth. So though Leah does not have the love of Yaakov in the way that she yearns, perhaps, she does have currency in the form of children. And that is very significant, especially in her particular circumstances and time. And she has 4 sons in very quick succession: Reuven, Shimon, Levi, and Yehudah. And in the text in Genesis 29, which you have on your source sheet, she has each child she names. So I think that is significant, that Leah names all of her children, all 7 of them, that we are aware of. And every one of her children, except for Dinah, which we'll talk about in a moment, all of her sons are given names for very particular reasons. And the first 4, I think, are probably the most important, although we can talk about Yisachar and Zebulun a little bit later. But she has 4 sons in very quick succession. Reuven, now perhaps my husband will see that I have borne him a son and will love me. Shimon, now perhaps my husband will hear that he has 2 sons from me, and that will draw him to me, that will make him love me. Shimon coming from Shema, Shin Mem Ayin, the Hebrew word for hearing. Reuven coming from the root Resh Aleph Hey, to see. So we're going from seeing to hearing. Then our third name, she has a son and names him Levi. For now, perhaps my husband will be attached to me, and that I have borne him 3 sons. So we've gone from different sensory experiences, sight and hearing, but now we've moved into a different space. Leah first hopes that her husband will really have that deep sense of, oh my goodness, my wife has borne me this beautiful son. Let me find a way to really connect with her, neshama to neshama, soul to soul. Maybe that will draw me into loving her. Of course, that doesn't work. She has Shimon, she has Levi. By the time she has Levi, she simply is saying, maybe my husband will at least attach himself in some way to me, and in some kind of emotional way at least. And then she has Yehuda. And when she names Yehuda, she says, and now I will praise Hashem, for I have borne 4 sons. There is no mention of Yaakov at that point. At this point, Leah is simply expressing gratitude. And there are a lot of different ways that we could understand, why is it that Leah in this moment is expressing her gratitude for the 4 sons, as opposed to continuing to yearn for Yaakov's love. And I understand this as a way of Leah actually expressing a lot of agency and saying, my life is not going to turn out the way I would like it to. I want perhaps a marriage with my husband that is deeply fulfilling, to use very modern terms. Of course, we have to be very careful to not retroject, but to say for Leah, I want a marriage that is going to feel deeply fulfilling to me. And yet it appears that that is not to be my lot. And we can hold the emotions that Leah must have been experiencing around sorrow and sadness. And what does it mean that that's not going to be her lot? That marriage in the way that her sister experiences is not going to be her lot. Yet expressing gratitude, I don't believe is an expression of subservience or an expression of, well, it's not going to get any better than this. I've just got to accept this. It's not going to get any better than this. I think, in fact, it's Leah expressing her own gratitude for her life as it is, and for being able to bring into the world all of these neshamas, all these different souls, through her children and through their descendants. And the Jewish people are known as Yehuda, from the root for gratitude, because of this. Leah is understood to be the first person in Tanakh to actually express gratitude to God, and in a certain sense is deeply spiritual in her own way, which is really interesting to think about in the light of what little we actually have to go on about Leah. And I think that that's also really interesting to really look at her story in its original context, because as I've talked about in prior sessions of this series, there is a new, I wouldn't call it field, but perhaps a body of what we might call modern Midrash Shame, which are takes on biblical narrative that are written in contemporaneous ways. So a lot of this comes from the feminist revolution in the Jewish community in the 70s and forward. There are some really well-known collections of Midrash Shame, one of which I brought in our first session called Sisters at Sinai by Rav Jill Hammer, in which she does have a story about Leah and Rachel. And another book that some folks may be familiar with, which I have not looked at in quite some time, but it was very popular in its day, called The Red Tent by Anita Diamond, which really focuses on Dinah's story, but actually really does weave in Leah and Rachel. That is definitely a novel. It was put together as such. It is understood as such, though there are people who still would understand it to be, in its own way, modern Midrash. The Red Tent is extraordinarily imaginative, and though it is based on the biblical text, it takes that biblical text and runs with it in very different directions that we don't have evidence for in the actual biblical text. And one of the things that Midrash Shame are very interested in doing is filling in gaps in narrative. So what we have about Leah, for example, is Leah is unloved. Leah has 4 sons in quick succession. Rachel remains without biological children. And we know that there must have been some kind of interior life happening for Leah. And we get a sense of that through the actual text in terms of how she names her children. To me as a reader, the despair really jumps off of the text. And as responsible readers of Torah, we are all bringing our own particular understandings to the text. And it is my personal belief that when we are learning Torah, when we are reading and encountering our sacred narrative, that it's really important to work with the text as we have it, as we imagine the possibilities for what these women's lives could have been and might have been if we actually had more recorded from them. And because the sketches that we actually have of Leah, Rachel, Bilha, and Zilpah are in fact so sparse, we as human readers and modern readers, I think, can't but help interject our own wonderings, our own questions, our own feelings into the text. I'm going to pause here before we move to talking about Rachel individually, and I will welcome any questions either in the chat or via the raised hand feature.
Yes, and if you don't know how to find the raise hand feature, you can put in the chat that you'd like to ask your question verbally or your comment. Lauren, everyone was wishing you well and that you should feel better. And
oh, thank you all so much.
Tea and honey, or honey and lemon, I think was.
Yes, thank you. I really appreciate the sentiment, folks. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
Okay, Rebecca, go ahead and unmute.
Hi, good morning. Thank you, Rabbi. And again, thank you for giving class, even though you're not feeling well. It does not bother any of us. We love learning with you. So no need to apologize. Quick question. I was taking notes. I think I missed something. You were indicating something about the relationship between the 2 sisters and suggesting that maybe they were closer to each other than it appears in the reading that we get.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much for that question. What I was suggesting there was that there's a Midrash. There's a really famous Midrash that basically says that Rachel was aware that Lavon was going to sub in Leah. And she didn't want Leah to be humiliated. And so because she didn't want Leah to be humiliated, she actually physically laid under Yaakov and Leah's bed, which, you know, we can have whatever feelings we want about that particular part of Midrash, but be that as it may, she lays under the bed and actually gives gives Leah simanim, gives her signs, actually speaks for her so that Yaakov is hearing Rachel's voice and not Leah's, to the point where that would ensure that Leah was not humiliated the next day. Now, that is a beautiful classical Midrash, and I think that it really makes the sisters feel a lot closer than it appears in the actual text.
Interesting. Thank you. Of course, in modern days, we can think of a lot of other ways for her to have reassured her sister.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. In modern days, we
intended rather than that position, but thank you.
Yes, of course, of course. That's why I'm saying it's one of those Midrash Shame that's like, what do we do with this today? But it's there, and it's very well known, especially in more traditional circles.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, Carol put a question in the chat box. How are we supposed to take Leah's complicity in the deception?
Yeah, love that question, Carol. I have the same question because that's another glaring gap in the text. I mean, I'm curious. It's like, was Leah informed of this ahead of time? I think that the Midrash that I just recounted might be an answer to that question, at least from the classical rabbis. but I don't necessarily know that it really answers satisfactorily the question. I think that, in fact, there isn't a great answer. It's one of those questions that, as responsible readers of text, we have to just sit with every year or every time we read the text. This story, coincidentally or perhaps not, was read in our Torah reading cycle 2 weeks ago. We are now in Parashat Vayeshev this week, but we read Parashat Vayetzei 2 weeks ago, and this is a very important part of that parsha. So I think it's a beautiful question, and it's one of those things that I think we don't have a great answer, and we just have to sit with that. I think that could also point to some of Leah's agency, because one of the other things I'd meant to mention is that Leah has 4 sons. Rachel then says in Genesis 31, she's very angry to Yaakov and says, "Give me children or I shall die." And Yaakov, and the most loving response, says, "Well, who am I? Am I God? Am I not greater to you than 10 sons? Like, don't blame me." I mean, it's one of those moments you read it, you're like, Yaakov, you are missing the point, right? Rachel is desperate. She doesn't have children. She wants children. She says, "Well, all right, fine. So I'll give you Bilha, and perhaps I will have children through her." That is a really reminiscent of Sarah and Hagar, a couple of parshiot ago, when Sarah, unable to have a child, actually says to Abraham, "Take Hagar as Isha, as wife, and have a son through her, and that son will then effectively be my son." Because in that particular lineal system, children born to enslaved women were considered to be the descendant of their mistress. So that was as true for Hagar and Sarah as it is for Rachel and Bilha. And then Bilha, of course, has 2 sons. We don't know anything about her other than the fact that she is the Shifcha of Rachel. And I think it's important to kind of name that and to really grapple with it. And if you're interested in thinking about that more contemporaneously, there's a book called Womanist Midrash that I have referenced a couple of times, written by an Episcopal priest named Wilda Goffney, who has a lot of Jewish literacy and familiarity. And she writes about the women of the Tanakh and a lot on Genesis, and does a particular section on Bilha and Zilpah, and talks about the particular conditions of Bilha and Zilpah being the slaves, the handmaids of Leah and Rachel. So we're at a point now where Leah has 4 sons. Rachel now has 2, although of course they really are they are truly Bilha. They're truly Bilha's sons, Dan and Naphtali. Leah, excuse me. Leah, in a moment of maybe frustration, maybe exercising agency of some kind, says to her son Reuben, "Give me some of those mandrakes, and I'm going to have Yaakov come to me tonight." And mandrakes are some kind of like potato-like tuber. I don't quite understand what they are, but they're basically they're some kind of aphrodisiac, or they were understood that way. And Yaakov goes and spends the night with Leah. Leah ends up having 2 more sons, Yisachar and Zivulun, and then has her daughter Dinah, who features later in a very distressing narrative. And we have Leah, so we've got these 2 particular scenes of Leah, the first one having to do with the first 4 sons, the second one having to do with the mandrakes and the latter 2 sons. And I think it's also important to note that Leah, recognizing that Rachel has had 2 sons effectively through Bilha, but I think it's important for us to say that those are truly Bilha's children, says, "All right, why don't I have Yaakov take my Shifcha Zilpah as Isha, as wife, and I'll have more children that way," as if 4 sons were not enough. And it's really interesting to understand that particular impulse, because as a responsible reader and as an inquisitive reader of text, and as a faithful reader of text, you look at that and you think to yourself, well, what is going on for Leia? There's so many unanswered questions. Does she have some sense of jealousy? Is it an issue of dissatisfaction? Is it an issue of recognizing that her place is tenuous? I mean, I can't even imagine what it must feel like to effectively be in this childbearing competition. I hate to put it in that language, but you've got, Leah has 4 sons. Rachel has none biologically at this point, but has 2 effectively. And perhaps if we're thinking about Leah with a very compassionate perspective, perhaps Leah is worried that Yaakov will no longer have anything to do with her at all. Will have nothing to do with her at all. Or perhaps, reading it very simply, Rachel has Yaakov sleep with Bilha, and so Leah does the same with Zilpah. Now, again, I feel like we cannot overemphasize and cannot say this enough. Bilha and Zilpah, if Rachel and Leah have no agent, have very limited agency, Bilha and Zilpah have no agency at all here. We don't hear from them at all. And the only other time we hear from Bilha is when Reuven rapes her later in the narrative, which is just, we don't know anything about, other than the fact that he has done this. And so it's a very challenging narrative, but I think it's one that we really owe it to ourselves to dig into, and not in a way where we're saying, oh, let's distance ourselves from this. This is terrible. We're in a much better time today, but actually in a way that says, what does it mean that this is part of our sacred text and this is part of our Torah? And Torah is a tree of life to all who cling to it. And that if we are to be really in deep and right relationship with Torah, that means being in deep relationship with these personalities in one way or another. It does not in any way, shape, or form accept or excuse any behavior. It simply means that we are grappling with the text. And I'm going to pause here and invite anyone to jump in at this point.
Yeah, so I'll ask a question from the chat, and then Mary, followed by Michelle, have questions to ask. So someone asked if you could comment on the idea that even though Leah felt unloved by Yaakov, they still had frequent sex, and the idea that it sounds as though Leah is frequently dissatisfied. She was supposedly upset that she was to marry Esav, and now she's upset to be married to Yaakov, even though she had valuable currency at the time, i.e. sons.
Right, yes. In terms of the frequent sexual contact, I would say, I would imagine, and again, this is my best understanding at this point, and I am very open to different ways of understanding. But I would say it might have been really just a relationship of pure, trying to put this in the best possible way, it might have really been economic exclusively, and it may have been extraordinarily disconnecting. I could imagine, and again, this is my own thinking about this, but I could imagine a situation in which Leah is so aware that even though she is frequently having sex with Yaakov, that he's not present for her. She might have a deep, deep, deep desire for that kind of intimacy and connection that she's not getting. And that perhaps she feels Ke'ilu as though she just is providing a service. We don't know. There's so many unanswered questions. And I think that crucially, how we understand Yaakov and Leah probably says more about where we are in terms of our own life and our own relationships than the text, because the text is so open to interpretation. So every time we learn this narrative, we bring new insight to it. And I try to hold anything I say very lightly, because not only can I learn more and grow more as a human being, But also, I think that our own life experience and circumstances can lead themselves or can lend themselves to a more multifocal understanding of the text. So I would say that perhaps, you know, if we go with this classic midrash, which there is no indication in the actual text of the Torah that Leah was going to marry Esav, none whatsoever. That is a very famous midrash, though, and it's understood that Esav, because the tradition, as I spoke about last week, is really, in many ways, interested in Esav as a challenging character, that Leah felt in some way cast out, and that Rachel was going to marry Yaakov, who was going to then carry forward the Jewish lineage. So if we remove the midrash a little bit from our understanding and we simply look at the actual pshat of the text, the simple meaning of the text, there's just so much we don't know about Leah's interiority. And I feel, as someone who learns Torah and studies Torah, it feels so much to me like it's crying out to be interpreted.
Mary.
Yes, mine is more of a general question than specifically related to this, although it does relate. One of the things that I think we mentioned and we've talked about is the fact that you just mentioned interiority, and the fact that there is very little emotional fleshing out of these stories, particularly with regards to the women, and which is, I'm sure it's at the foundation of the movement to sort of fill in the women's stories as well, to sort of retake them from comparative anonymity. And mind you, this is not to offend or you know, sort of be man bashing, but couldn't that be simply because these are written by men for the most part, or written by men, period? And they're not, there's a tendency to focus more on events as opposed to motivations and emotions. Again, it's a general question.
Yeah, thank you, Mary, for that. It's such an important question and such an important area to surface. Yeah, you know, it simply could be exactly, it could be as simple as you've described it. Absolutely. I think that there is a lot there, and I couldn't have articulated it a bit better than you did. So yeah, I think the answer is really in your question. And I believe that that is largely why this movement has sprung up around the Jewish world, to try to fill in those gaps with women's narrative. And there's a risk there because every woman, you know, everyone is a subjective narrator and a subjective author. So we might find one retelling of the story more compelling than another. So that's just another thing to always bear in mind.
Michelle and then Rebecca after Michelle. Go ahead.
I was wondering, Rabbi had mentioned that Leah might have had some sort of like physical disability. And I guess I myself have a physical disability, so it's kind of a relatable thing. My first question is, in scripture, how were people with disabilities generally viewed? And also, it also says that God chooses the weaker people, the weaker things of the world to display his glory and his what's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, his glory, like his purposes, his work. So maybe Leah might have been chosen, being the weaker one, so to speak, that God would display his greatness through first, and then Rachel later.
That is such a beautiful question. Thank you so much for putting it out there. So to, to your first question around how does the Torah relate to people with disabilities, that is one of those questions that if we had, an extra month of the course, we could really, really go into. If it is okay with you, Julie, before we end the course, before we end the hour, I can drop into the chat my website because I have done a lot of, I'm sorry, can you say that again, Julie?
Oh, absolutely. I'll find it and drop it in the chat box.
That'd be wonderful. Yeah, because I have done a lot of work around that. And I give a lot of different talks on that. And there's a particular talk on my website called my Eli talk, which I think actually might be on My Jewish Learning now, where I speak directly about disability and Torah. So if that is an area that you're really interested in, I encourage you to follow up and we can be in conversation about that. I'm happy to point you into some resources and to some colleagues of mine as well. Really important topic, especially in light of modern disability studies, and particularly as more people with disabilities become clergy, there is a greater work, there's more work being done around sacred text and disability. So it's a very important area, and I absolutely encourage you to explore it, and happy to talk more offline. So to the second piece, it could be. I mean, that is certainly a very legitimate possibility. It is certainly a very legitimate theological possibility that Leah was very specifically chosen to be who she is. We get this very directly with Moshe, and come back for my Parsha study on Parashat Ve'era when we'll be talking about this directly. We get this sense of particular ways of navigating physical disability when it comes to Moshe specifically. And so perhaps Leah is very much in that line. Absolutely. I think that is a very interesting possibility for further exploration. Do we have any other questions?
Yes, we have Rebecca. Go ahead, Rebecca.
Thanks, first of all, for a really interesting discussion. My question is about where Yaakov is in all of this, because he gets pushed around by the women, essentially. Leah says, now sleep with my sisters, now sleep with my slave. The same goes for Rachel. There's an incident with the mandrakes where essentially the sisters barter his favors with each other. So where is he in all of this? Because he just gets sent from bed to bed and doesn't seem to have much of a choice about that.
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca. I unfortunately went in and out a little bit, but I think I got most of that. If there's any bit I did not get, please jump in. Yeah, no, it's really interesting. Yaakov, in some ways, has very little agency, right? You're kind of imagining, like, this bed this night, this bed the next night. If you actually think about it in those ways, like, yeah, he is moving around among the women, and the women make choices about who he will take to wife. And I think that there is a lot of questions that we can ask. There are a lot of questions we can ask about Yaakov and where he is in all of this. And when I think about the end of the narrative it's not on the source sheet, but there is a lengthy scene where after Yosef is born, I entered the source sheet just before this piece. After Yosef is born, presumably 20 years have passed since Yaakov has arrived at Lavan's house in Haran. And he says, let me go with my children and my wives and my animals and all of the wealth that I have acquired back to my father's house. And this precipitates a very challenging encounter between him and Lavan, particularly around wage theft. And there's also a very interesting story in which Yaakov, or unbeknownst to Yaakov, Rachel steals Lavan's idols, hides them in her tent. When Lavon notices that his idols have been stolen, he goes through his daughter's tents. And what's interesting is that Leah and Rachel have separate tents, which to me makes sense because they're both wives of Yaakov and have children. And they go through the tents, and Lavon does not find his missing idols. And the reason that he does not find his missing idols, we come to learn later, is because because Rachel claims that due to menstruation, she is sitting on the idols and cannot get up because she is menstruating. Now, this is one of those stories that, again, Rachel is using agency and really pulling one over Yaakov. Yaakov has no idea. But in the end, Rachel claims innocence and presumably keeps the idols, or we don't know what happens to them. But Yaakov is completely, he's completely overtaken by this. He has no idea. This is a total surprise to him. And it again points to your question of Yaakov seems to be, not exercising a lot of his own choice. Now, we see that in terms of his acquisition of wealth. We see that in terms of the way in which he placed kind of magnificent animal husbandry, which I do not claim to have any understanding of that part of the narrative around how he manages to end up leaving with the better of the flocks. There's a whole back and forth around the flocks and the speckled and the spotted, and he's telling Lavon that he's not going to give him any of the speckled or the spotted, and somehow works it out so that he ends up with the more prized animals. And I think that is one of those cases in which Yaakov does show up in the narrative. But I think you're right to mention that he really is I don't even say at the whim, I keep saying that, I don't even mean it that way. He's as part of the structure as the women are. And perhaps that's the point. Perhaps the point is for us as seekers and readers of Torah to recognize that actually all people who are involved in one way or another in the structure that we have presented to us are, to put it in more modern terms, being harmed by it, or to put it perhaps in more soft language, are not actually able to fully self-actualize, or not actually able to fully direct the course of their lives. And so too are so many of us caught in structures that do not afford us as much ability to direct the course of our lives as directly as we might want to. So I hope that is helpful in some way.
There is one more question. Can you take another question now, Rabbi Lauren?
Absolutely. We've still got about 5 minutes.
Okay, great. BJ, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Okay, I live in Georgia now, but I used to live in southern Massachusetts. And I went to a synagogue in Rhode Island. We needed a new rabbi, and we interviewed several. One of the rabbis stuttered so badly that we could hardly understand him. And I often wondered what happened to him. So that was his disability, a rabbi that was stuttering all the time. And like I said before, I often wondered what happened to him. Did he ever get a rabbinate? And also I want to say this is the first time that I have joined this class, and I find it very, very interesting.
Thank you. Thank you very much, BJ, for sharing that narrative, for sharing your experiences with us. Thank you. And thank you for being here.
Okay, any other questions? I'll read a comment from the chat box. Uriel said, where did that go? I've always looked at these two women in terms of the tribes born from them. In my point of view, that would make Leah the primary wife.
Yes, absolutely. And to add to that point, in egalitarian context, so in contexts that include matriarchs in the Avot Bracha, the Amidah, which is the opening blessing of the Amidah, it's the blessing that says, Baruch atah Hashem, Eloheinu, v'Elokei Avotenu, blessed are you God, of our fathers and mothers, if you're adding the matriarchs, Elokei Abraham, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov, Elokei Sarah, Elokei Rivka, and then some versions, Elokei Rachel, the Leah, and others do exactly as you are presenting, actually say Leah before Rachel, because of the idea that in fact Leah is the primary wife, despite the fact that the tradition really lifts up Rachel based on the number of tribes that come forth that are born to them. And I think that that is one of those really interesting questions to think about, primary versus non-primary. And I wonder if we can kind of move as a tradition sort of out of there a little bit and instead say, you know, both of them were equally wives of Yaakov, both of them bore children, as did Bilha and Zilpah, who we might also want to incorporate, as do some communities already, particularly renewal and reconstructionist communities, but an increasing number of other communities as well. And what does that mean for us to think about or to reorient our relationship with these women, given how little material we have to go on?
Carol asked a question in the chat, or made a comment. Let's see, where did it go? Sorry, sometimes it's hard to, there it is. Isn't it troubling that Rachel steals the trafim, the idols? Does she believe in them? After all, she grew up in Lavon's house. How are we supposed to deal with this?
Beautiful question, Carol. And I'm so glad we're talking about this as we end our class together. Again, when we think about spirituality of the imahot, of the matriarchs, there are so many unanswered questions. The trafim, the idols that Rachel steals, right? We don't know. You know, I'm very curious myself, like, did Rachel have a relationship with them? How did she connect to them at all, if at all? Growing up in Lavon's house, one could imagine that that was a part of her spirituality. But again, because we don't have direct female perspective, except for the stealing of the teraphim, we don't know. And that brings forward a lot of rich possibility of what their spiritual lives were like. And I know I've referenced this book a couple of times already. It's called Womanist Midrash by Dr. Wilda Goffney. She posits, and I don't know that I totally agree with her. She posits that Rachel did not believe in the God of Yaakov. She posits that Rachel had a totally separate spiritual life. We don't know, and our tradition is very interested and invested in assuring us that the matriarchs, the imahot, dafka, very explicitly believed in Elohei Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov. That they, once upon marrying, as it were, Abraham and then Yitzchak, you know, Abraham and Sarah, and Yitzchak and Rivka, and Rachel and Yaakov with Rachel and Leah and Bilha and Zilpah, that the matriarchs became part of our spiritual lineage and are therefore part of this larger monotheistic understanding of spirituality. There are women who have written midrashic stories that would question that. There are also plenty of far more traditional women who absolutely hold that, of course, the imahot believed in the God of Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov. Absolutely, but that was a foundational part of who they were. And so it's, again, one of those gaps in the text that we answer based, I believe, on our predilections. If you're someone who is more traditionally minded, you approach the text with that sense of reverence and that sense of lineage and that sense of being part of something so much greater than you are. And that's going to, of course, have an impact on how we read the text. And so too, if a person has a less traditional understanding of Torah, that will, of course, also affect how they read the text. So what we've done these past 3 sessions is allowing ourselves to open to imaginative possibility, but doing so as responsible readers and recipients of text. Because we don't have a ton of material in the actual shot of the Torah, in the direct and simple reading of Torah, we are perhaps gifted with an ability to imagine the gaps and fill those in. And there are always risks inherent in doing that, because if we are to be intellectually and spiritually honest, we have so little to work with that we have to, in my view, be very careful around how we use the material and how we think about Midrash Shame and how we might apply our own understanding into the actual text, and to do so in a way that's really generative. So that is what I hope we've done together these past 3 sessions. And I'm going to now turn it back to Julie. I know we have reached time, so thank you all for being here. I'm going to just drop into the chat my website URL, and so that way, if you're interested in my work, you can follow me there. Also, I've done some Torah study for my Jewish learning, so that's on the YouTube channel, and I'll hand it back over to Julie. Thank you so much.